The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren Afghan landscape as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She had been in position for over 18 hours, watching the compound below through her crosshairs. The mission was supposed to be simple: provide overwatch for the extraction team, eliminate any threats, and get out clean. Nothing about this operation had gone according to plan. Sarah pressed her eye against the scope again, scanning the dusty courtyard where her team should have emerged hours ago. The silence from her radio had been deafening since the last garbled transmission from Sergeant Rodriguez at 0400 hours. Something about heavy resistance, casualties, and a request for immediate support that she couldn't provide from her elevated position 2 clicks away. Her throat felt like sandpaper despite the water she had rationed carefully throughout the night. The desert heat was already building, promising another scorching day that would test every limit of human endurance. Sarah had trained for this, had excelled in every survival course the Navy had thrown at her, but training and reality were two different beasts entirely. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance made her heart race with hope. Finally, extraction. She grabbed her radio and tried once more to establish contact with her team, but only static answered her calls. The helicopters grew louder, closer, and Sarah began packing her equipment with practiced efficiency. Every movement was calculated to minimize exposure while maintaining her ability to provide cover if needed. Through her scope, she saw the first Black Hawk touch down in a cloud of dust about 500 meters from her position. Relief flooded through her as she watched the familiar figures of her teammates emerge from the compound. But her relief turned to ice-cold dread as she counted heads. 3 men stumbled toward the helicopter, supporting each other in various states of injury. Where were the other 4 members of her 8-person team? Sarah's radio crackled to life suddenly, Rodriguez's voice cutting through the static like a knife through her chest. His words hit her harder than any enemy bullet could have. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. An ambush had torn through their ranks, and they had barely escaped with their lives. The compound had been a trap, and they had walked right into it. But it was Rodriguez's next words that changed everything. Command had made a decision. The mission was officially scrubbed, the team was being extracted immediately, and there was no time to collect her from her position. The enemy was mobilizing, more helicopters were inbound to hunt down any remaining American forces, and the extraction window was closing fast. Sarah watched in stunned disbelief as the helicopter lifted off, carrying her wounded teammates to safety. The radio crackled one more time, Rodriguez's voice thick with emotion and barely audible over the rotor wash. He was sorry. Command had made the call. She was officially classified as missing in action, presumed killed in the operation. They would come back for her, he promised, but not today. Maybe not tomorrow. The second helicopter never landed. It circled her general area twice, as if the crew was searching for signs of life, then banked toward the horizon and disappeared into the morning haze. Sarah was alone in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with limited supplies, no extraction plan, and enemy forces that would soon be combing the area for any survivors. She lay still for nearly an hour after the helicopters vanished, processing the reality of her situation. The Navy SEALs had a motto that every operator lived by: leave no man behind. But sometimes, tactical reality trumped idealism. Sometimes, saving 7 men meant sacrificing 1. Command had made a calculation, weighing her life against the lives of her teammates and the success of future operations. Sarah understood the logic even as it tore her heart apart. Her position was compromised, the enemy was closing in, and a rescue attempt would likely result in more casualties. She had always known this was a possibility. Every operator did. But understanding something intellectually and living it were vastly different experiences. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature soared past 100 degrees. Sarah began taking inventory of her supplies with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through countless missions. Water, 2.5 liters, enough for maybe 2 days if she was careful. Food, energy bars and MREs that would last 4 days if she rationed strictly. Ammunition, enough to fight her way out of most situations, but not enough for a prolonged engagement. Her radio had enough battery life for perhaps 6 more hours of intermittent use. After that, she would be completely cut off from any friendly forces. Sarah made the difficult decision to power it down except for scheduled communication windows. If Rodriguez and the team were going to mount an unauthorized rescue mission, they would need time to plan and execute it without detection by their own command structure. The compound below had fallen silent, but Sarah knew that the quiet was deceptive. Enemy fighters would be moving into the area soon, searching for any evidence of American presence. Her elevated position provided excellent visibility and fields of fire, but it also made her vulnerable to detection if she wasn't careful about her movements and heat signature. Sarah spent the next several hours preparing her position for a potentially extended stay. She created multiple firing positions, cached supplies in different locations, and established escape routes that would allow her to evade pursuit if her position was discovered. Every action was driven by training and experience, but beneath the professional competence was a growing awareness of just how desperate her situation had become. As afternoon approached, Sarah saw the first enemy patrol moving through the valley below. A dozen men in traditional Afghan dress, carrying assault rifles and moving with the confidence of people on their home ground. They were searching methodically, checking every possible hiding spot and firing position. It was only a matter of time before they worked their way up to her location. Sarah made another difficult decision. She would have to move, abandoning the high ground that had been her primary tactical advantage. The alternative was almost certain discovery and death. She had trained for evasion and escape scenarios, but always with the assumption that friendly forces would be actively searching for her. This time, she was truly on her own. The weight of isolation pressed down on her as she prepared to move. Every Navy SEAL underwent psychological evaluation and training designed to prepare them for exactly this scenario. But no amount of training could fully prepare someone for the crushing realization that they had been written off, left behind to survive or die based on their own skills and determination. Sarah checked her compass and studied the terrain map one last time. To the north lay more mountains and potentially better hiding spots, but also more distance from any possible rescue. To the south was the Pakistani border, neutral territory where she might find refuge, but crossing it would mean abandoning any hope of rescue by her own forces. East and west offered only more desert and increased likelihood of running into enemy patrols. She chose north, toward the mountains where caves and rocky terrain would provide better concealment. The decision meant accepting that survival, not rescue, was now her primary objective. Sarah sealed her emotions behind the mental barriers that SEAL training had taught her to construct. Grief, anger, and fear were luxuries she couldn't afford. Survival required absolute focus and unwavering determination. As she prepared to move out, Sarah took one last look at the valley where her teammates had disappeared into the desert haze hours earlier. She whispered a promise that she would make it home, that their sacrifice in leaving her behind wouldn't be wasted. She would survive whatever the desert threw at her, and she would find her own way back to friendly territory. The enemy patrol was getting closer, their voices carrying on the afternoon wind. Sarah shouldered her pack, checked her weapon one final time, and began the lonely journey that would test every limit of her training, her endurance, and her will to live. Behind her, the compound where everything had gone wrong grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely into the vast emptiness of the Afghan wilderness. Miles away, Rodriguez sat in the medical tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman, his arm in a sling and his heart heavy with guilt. He stared at the radio that had carried Sarah's last transmission, knowing that command would never authorize a rescue mission for someone officially listed as killed in action. But Rodriguez also knew something that command didn't: Sarah Mitchell was the strongest, most determined operator he had ever served with. If anyone could survive alone in that hellish landscape, it was her. The question wasn't whether she would try to make it home. The question was whether the desert would break her before she found her way back to the world of the living. The first night alone tested every psychological barrier Sarah had built during her years of service. She had found shelter in a shallow cave about 3 miles north of her original position, just as darkness swallowed the desert whole. The temperature dropped 40 degrees within hours, transforming the scorching landscape into a frigid wasteland that seemed to leach warmth from her bones. Sarah huddled in her sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl through the rocky crevices above her head. Every sound made her reach for her sidearm, every shadow could be hiding an enemy fighter. Sleep came in fragments, brief moments of unconsciousness interrupted by adrenaline surges that left her heart racing and her muscles tensed for action. During one of these midnight awakenings, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices, speaking in Pashto, growing closer to her position. She had been careful to cover her tracks, but the enemy fighters knew this terrain far better than she did. They knew where someone would naturally seek shelter, where the hiding spots were, and how to track even the most careful operator. Sarah eased her rifle into position and controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate despite the surge of adrenaline. Through her night vision scope, she counted 8 men moving in a loose search pattern. They were being methodical, checking every cave and overhang. Her position would be discovered within minutes. The decision to engage or evade came down to mathematics and probability. 8 armed men in their home territory versus 1 exhausted operator with limited ammunition and no backup. Sarah chose discretion, slipping deeper into the cave system she had only partially explored. The passages were narrow and twisted, carved by centuries of water flow that had long since dried up. For 2 hours, Sarah navigated the underground maze while the search party worked their way through the area above. Several times she heard footsteps directly overhead, muffled conversations, and the scrape of equipment against rock. Once, a flashlight beam swept across the cave entrance she had vacated just minutes earlier. The hunters were thorough, patient, and determined. When dawn finally broke and the voices faded into the distance, Sarah emerged from the depths to find that the enemy patrol had left clear signs of their presence. Boot prints in the sand, cigarette butts, and, most ominously, chalk marks on several cave entrances. They were marking the ones they had searched, creating a systematic grid that would make future searches even more efficient. Sarah realized that staying in the cave system was no longer viable. The enemy knew the area was occupied and would return with more men and better equipment. She needed to move again, pushing deeper into territory that was increasingly hostile and unfamiliar. The psychological pressure of constant movement, combined with sleep deprivation and rationed food, was beginning to take its toll. The second day brought new challenges. Sarah's water situation had become critical, and the nearest source she could identify on her map was a seasonal spring 15 miles to the northeast. The journey would take her through exposed terrain during daylight hours, but waiting for nightfall meant another day without adequate hydration in the desert heat. Sarah made the difficult choice to move during the day, using every piece of cover available and stopping frequently to scan for threats. The landscape was unforgiving, consisting of loose sand, sharp rocks, and vegetation that provided little concealment. Every step required careful placement to avoid leaving obvious tracks, and every pause required total alertness to detect approaching danger. Halfway to the spring, Sarah encountered her first close call with a local farmer herding goats across her path. The man was elderly, weathered by decades of desert life, and sharp-eyed enough to spot movement where there should be none. For several minutes, Sarah lay motionless behind a boulder while the farmer studied the area where she was hidden. The old man spoke to his goats in a gentle voice that carried across the silence, but his eyes never stopped scanning the rocks where Sarah waited. She could see his hands clearly, noting the absence of weapons, but also knowing that a single shot from him could bring every enemy fighter in the area down on her position. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the farmer continued on his way, driving his goats toward distant pastures. Sarah remained hidden for another 30 minutes, watching his progress across the valley floor. Only when he disappeared completely behind a ridge did she dare to move again. The spring, when she finally reached it, was barely more than a muddy seepage between 2 rocks. But it was water, and Sarah filled every container she carried while keeping constant watch for approaching threats. The water tasted of minerals and earth, but it was the most precious substance on the planet at that moment. Sarah allowed herself a few extra swallows beyond her strict rationing plan, knowing that the journey ahead would demand every ounce of strength she could maintain. As evening approached, Sarah faced another critical decision about her location for the night. The spring was an obvious place for enemy patrols to check, but moving away from the only water source meant accepting even greater risk. She compromised by finding a position that allowed her to watch the spring from concealment while maintaining multiple escape routes. That night brought the sound of helicopters again, but these were not American aircraft. Sarah recognized the distinctive rotor noise of Soviet-era helicopters that were still common in the region. They circled the area for over an hour, using searchlights to probe every shadow and crevice. The beams passed within meters of Sarah's position several times, but her camouflage and disciplined stillness kept her hidden. The helicopter search confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect: the enemy was mounting a systematic effort to find her. This wasn't just a routine patrol stumbling across her trail. Someone had put significant resources into hunting down the American sniper who had escaped their trap. Whether it was for propaganda value, intelligence purposes, or simple revenge, Sarah had become a high-priority target. The realization brought both fear and a strange sense of purpose. If the enemy was investing this much effort in capturing her, it meant they considered her a significant threat. Sarah had always prided herself on being an effective operator, but facing this level of focused attention was both terrifying and oddly validating. During the third day, Sarah's situation deteriorated further when she spotted a convoy of vehicles moving along the valley floor below her position. Through her scope, she counted 12 trucks filled with armed fighters, plus several technical vehicles mounting heavy machine guns. This wasn't a search patrol, this was a small army being deployed to hunt her down. The convoy stopped at several locations that Sarah recognized from her map study. They were establishing checkpoints, creating a network of observation posts that would make movement during daylight nearly impossible. Sarah watched with growing concern as fighters dismounted and began setting up what appeared to be long-term positions. Her radio, which she had been saving for emergency communications, crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. The signal was weak and heavily encrypted, but Sarah recognized Rodriguez's voice cutting through the static. The message was brief and coded, but the meaning was clear. An unofficial rescue mission was being planned, but it would take time to organize without detection by their own command. Rodriguez's voice carried guilt and determination in equal measure. He told her to stay alive, to keep moving, and to listen for extraction signals on an emergency frequency. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Sarah with the first hope she had felt since being abandoned. But hope came with its own burden, the knowledge that her teammates were risking their careers and possibly their lives to save someone their superiors had already written off. Sarah spent the rest of the day observing the enemy positions and planning routes that would avoid the new checkpoints. The task seemed almost impossible. The enemy had positioned their forces to control every major passage through the mountains, every water source, and every likely hiding spot. They were forcing her into increasingly marginal terrain where survival itself would be a victory. As the fourth night fell, Sarah made a decision that went against every tactical principle she had learned. Instead of continuing to retreat deeper into the mountains, she would circle back toward the original mission area. The enemy would expect her to run away from their strength, not toward it. Sometimes the most dangerous course of action was also the safest. The night movement was harrowing. Sarah had to cross several roads and open areas where enemy patrols might detect her. Each crossing required careful timing and absolute silence. Once, she lay motionless for over an hour while a patrol passed within 10 meters of her position. Their flashlights swept back and forth, probing shadows and highlighting her vulnerability. But Sarah's gamble paid off. By dawn, she had reached an abandoned village that showed no signs of recent enemy activity. The buildings were partially destroyed, probably by bombing or artillery fire from previous conflicts, but they offered better shelter than anything she had found in the mountains. In the basement of what had once been a house, Sarah found a cache of old supplies, blankets, canned food, and, most importantly, a hand-drawn map of the local area with notations in English. Some other military unit had used this location as a safe house, and their intelligence was still valuable years later. The map showed several routes that didn't appear on Sarah's official charts, including what appeared to be a smuggler's trail that led toward the Pakistani border. More importantly, it marked several other caches and safe houses that might still contain useful supplies. For the first time since being abandoned, Sarah allowed herself to believe that survival was possible. The abandoned village offered temporary security, the intelligence windfall had improved her tactical situation dramatically, and the radio message from Rodriguez meant that rescue, however unlikely, remained a possibility. But, as Sarah settled into her new hiding place, she could hear the distant sound of vehicles and helicopters continuing their search. The enemy hadn't given up, and they had resources that she could barely imagine. The real test of her endurance, both physical and psychological, was just beginning. Outside the ruined building, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the star-filled sky. Sarah checked her weapons one more time and tried to calculate how long her remaining supplies would last. Mathematics had never been her favorite subject, but now it might determine whether she lived or died in this forgotten corner of the world. The abandoned village became Sarah's home for 6 days, a temporary sanctuary that allowed her to recover some strength while planning her next moves. During daylight hours, she remained hidden in the basement, emerging only after dark to explore the surrounding buildings and search for additional supplies. The village had been thoroughly destroyed, but destruction often concealed treasures for someone who knew how to look. On the third day in the village, Sarah discovered something that changed everything, a hidden room behind a false wall in what had been the village's small mosque. Inside, she found evidence that American Special Forces had indeed used this location as a forward operating base. Radio equipment, ammunition, medical supplies, and, most importantly, detailed intelligence files about local enemy movements and safe routes. The files were several months old, but they painted a picture of enemy operations that matched what Sarah was experiencing. The local Taliban commander, a man known as Nasir Shah, had been systematically hunting down isolated American personnel for both propaganda and tactical advantages. Sarah's situation wasn't unique, she was simply the latest in a series of cat-and-mouse games that had been playing out across this region. More disturbing was the revelation that Nasir Shah had a particular obsession with capturing female American soldiers. The intelligence files contained reports of 3 previous incidents where women had been specifically targeted, captured, and used for propaganda videos before being executed. Sarah realized that her gender had made her an even more valuable prize, explaining the extraordinary resources being deployed to find her. The knowledge was sobering, but it also provided tactical advantages. The files contained detailed information about Nasir Shah's standard operating procedures, his preferred routes, and the locations of his camps. If Sarah was going to survive long enough for rescue, she needed to think like her enemy and anticipate his moves. Using the intelligence, Sarah began planning a route that would take her away from Nasir Shah's primary area of operations while staying within range of potential rescue operations. The path was complex, requiring her to cross several major wadis and navigate through terrain that offered minimal cover. But it also led toward a region where other American forces operated, increasing the chances that Rodriguez and his team could coordinate a rescue. On her 6th night in the village, Sarah's planning was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Through a crack in the basement wall, she watched as a convoy of trucks surrounded the village. This wasn't a routine patrol, this was a deliberate search based on intelligence. Someone had pointed them toward the abandoned village, possibly the same farmer who had seen her days earlier. Sarah had prepared for this possibility, creating multiple escape routes and caching supplies in different locations. As the enemy fighters dismounted and began their search, she gathered her essential gear and prepared to move. The basement had a tunnel that connected to an old well on the village's outskirts, an escape route she had discovered and improved during her stay. The tunnel was narrow and partially collapsed, requiring Sarah to crawl on her belly while dragging her pack behind her. She could hear voices and footsteps above as the search intensified. Twice, debris fell from the ceiling as fighters walked directly overhead. The journey through the tunnel took 20 minutes that felt like hours, every sound amplified by claustrophobia and fear. Sarah emerged from the well to find the village surrounded by enemy fighters, their vehicles positioned to block every obvious escape route. But her week of observation had shown her something the enemy didn't know, a dry stream bed that ran through the area, hidden by vegetation and invisible from most angles. The wadi would provide concealment for nearly 2 miles before opening into more exposed terrain. Moving through the stream bed required careful timing to avoid sentries, but Sarah's night vision equipment gave her a crucial advantage. She could see the enemy positions clearly while remaining invisible to their unaided eyes. For 3 hours, she moved like a ghost through the landscape, passing within meters of guard positions without detection. By dawn, Sarah had covered 8 miles and reached a rocky outcropping that offered both concealment and observation of her back trail. Behind her, smoke rose from the abandoned village as the enemy fighters burned the buildings they had searched. Whether they had found evidence of her presence or were simply being thorough, the message was clear: nowhere was safe for long. The destruction of the village marked a turning point in Sarah's psychological state. She had begun thinking of the ruined buildings as home, a dangerous emotional attachment that survival situations demanded she avoid. The loss of that temporary sanctuary forced her to confront the reality that she might be running for weeks or even months before finding safety. Sarah's food situation had become desperate. Despite careful rationing, she was down to less than 2 days of supplies. The intelligence files had mentioned several caches in the region, but locating them would require dangerous movement during daylight hours. Water was less critical thanks to the seasonal springs marked on the captured maps, but food was becoming a life-or-death issue. The decision to risk daylight movement to search for cached supplies went against every tactical instinct Sarah possessed. But starvation was as deadly as enemy bullets, and she needed to take calculated risks to maintain her strength for the challenges ahead. She spent hours studying the terrain and enemy movement patterns before choosing a route to the nearest cache location. The cache site was supposed to be hidden near a distinctive rock formation 12 miles northeast of her position. The journey would take her across exposed ground where concealment was minimal and detection almost certain if enemy patrols were in the area. Sarah chose a path that followed natural depressions and seasonal watercourses, trading speed for stealth. Halfway to her destination, Sarah encountered something that made her heart pound with both fear and hope: helicopter rotors in the distance, but not the Soviet-era aircraft the enemy had been using. The sound signature was distinctly American, the familiar rhythm of Black Hawk rotors that meant friendly forces were operating in the area. Sarah grabbed her emergency radio and tuned to the frequency Rodriguez had specified in his coded message. For several minutes, she heard only static, but then a faint signal came through. It wasn't Rodriguez's voice, but it was definitely American. Someone was calling for any friendly forces to respond, using authentication codes that only U.S. military personnel would know. The transmission was too weak and brief for Sarah to respond before the helicopter moved out of range, but it confirmed that rescue operations were indeed being conducted. Whether they were official missions or unauthorized attempts by her teammates, Sarah couldn't determine. But the knowledge that friendly forces were searching for survivors gave her the motivation to continue despite her deteriorating situation. The cache site, when she finally reached it, had been discovered and looted years earlier. All that remained were empty containers and equipment too damaged to be useful. Sarah's gamble had failed, leaving her in an even more precarious position with no food reserves and her location potentially compromised by the daylight movement. Desperation drove Sarah to make another dangerous decision. She would approach one of the isolated farms marked on her maps, hoping to find food through theft or barter. The risk was enormous. Local farmers were likely to be sympathetic to the Taliban or too afraid to help an American soldier. But starvation left her with few alternatives. Sarah chose a farm that appeared to be occupied by a single family, located in a valley that offered multiple escape routes if things went wrong. She spent an entire day observing the location, noting the patterns of daily activity and identifying the best approach routes. The farm had goats, chickens, and what appeared to be a small vegetable garden. As darkness fell, Sarah moved closer to the farmhouse, every sense alert for signs of danger. The family appeared to consist of an elderly man, a woman who might be his wife, and 2 young children. They seemed to be genuine farmers rather than fighters, but appearances could be deceiving in a war zone. Sarah's plan was simple: take what she needed from their food stores and leave payment in U.S. currency, hoping that the money would be seen as fair compensation rather than an insult. She had learned enough Pashto during her deployment to leave a written message explaining that she meant no harm and was grateful for their inadvertent assistance. The theft went smoothly. Sarah found stores of dried fruit, grain, and preserved meat that would extend her survival for another week. She left $50 in American bills, more than the food was worth by local standards, along with her written apology. As she prepared to leave, Sarah heard something that froze her blood: the sound of approaching motorcycles. Through the farmhouse window, Sarah watched as 3 armed men on motorcycles pulled into the courtyard. They dismounted and began talking to the farmer in urgent, aggressive tones. Even without understanding every word, Sarah could tell they were asking questions about American soldiers, describing her appearance, and demanding information about any suspicious activity. The farmer's responses seemed genuine in their ignorance, but one of the fighters wasn't satisfied. He began searching the outbuildings while his companions questioned the family more aggressively. Sarah realized that her presence had been detected somehow, possibly by the thermal signature of her body heat or simply by the systematic search pattern the enemy was conducting throughout the region. Sarah had 2 choices: run immediately and hope to escape before being detected, or wait for the fighters to leave and risk being discovered if they expanded their search. She chose to run, slipping away from the farmhouse while the fighters were focused on their interrogation of the family. Behind her, she heard raised voices and what sounded like a woman crying. The guilt hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her desperate search for food had potentially put an innocent family in danger. If the fighters found evidence of her presence at the farm, the consequences for the family could be severe. But there was nothing she could do to help them without making the situation worse. As Sarah put distance between herself and the farm, she forced herself to compartmentalize the guilt and focus on survival. Emotional attachments and moral considerations were luxuries she couldn't afford in her current situation. She had food now, enough to last another week if she rationed carefully, and she had gained valuable intelligence about enemy search patterns. But the encounter had also revealed how close her pursuers were getting. The systematic search was tightening like a noose, and Sarah was running out of places to hide. Soon, she would have to make a critical decision: continue evading and hope for rescue, or try to break out of the search area entirely and make her way to friendly territory on her own. The choice would determine whether she lived or died in the unforgiving landscape that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. 2 weeks after being abandoned, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible during her first night alone in the desert. She would stop running. Not because she had given up hope, but because she had finally understood something fundamental about survival that no training manual could teach: sometimes the only way forward was to turn and fight. The realization came during her 13th day of evasion, when Sarah found herself trapped in a canyon with enemy patrols approaching from both directions. She had been driven deeper into increasingly marginal terrain, forced to take greater and greater risks just to find water and shelter. The systematic search was working exactly as designed, compressing her options until mistake or capture became inevitable. But, as Sarah crouched in the shadows, listening to the voices of her hunters echoing off the canyon walls, she remembered something her instructor had said during SEAL training: when you can't run, when you can't hide, when all your options are gone, remember that you're still a weapon. Use yourself accordingly. The canyon trap had been carefully orchestrated. Sarah realized that the enemy fighters had been herding her toward this location for days, using false trails and deliberate gaps in their search pattern to guide her movement. Nasir Shah wasn't just hunting her, he was manipulating her, using her own survival instincts against her. Sarah spent her last hours of freedom studying the terrain and enemy positions with the analytical mind of a professional sniper. If she was going to make a stand, she would do it on her terms, using every advantage she could create. The canyon offered excellent fields of fire if she could reach the high ground, and the narrow passages would limit the enemy's ability to bring superior numbers to bear. As darkness fell, Sarah began moving toward the canyon's eastern rim, a climb that would take her directly past 2 enemy observation posts. But she wasn't trying to evade detection anymore, she was positioning herself for the most effective possible engagement. Every step was calculated to maximize her tactical advantages when the shooting started. The first enemy fighter died without ever knowing Sarah was there. She took him silently from behind while he was focused on watching the canyon floor, using techniques that had become second nature during years of special operations training. His body joined the shadows between the rocks, invisible to casual observation but positioned where it would be found when Sarah wanted it discovered. The second guard post required more finesse. 2 fighters were positioned where mutual observation made a silent approach impossible. Sarah solved the problem with a fragment grenade rolled precisely into their position, the explosion echoing through the canyon like thunder. The sound would bring every enemy fighter in the area running toward her position, but it would also announce that the hunted had become the hunter. Sarah reached the high ground just as chaos erupted throughout the canyon. Shouts, running footsteps, and the mechanical sounds of weapons being readied filled the night air. Vehicle engines roared to life as reinforcements rushed toward the sound of combat. Sarah estimated that she had perhaps 10 minutes before the canyon would be swarming with enemy fighters. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the entire battlefield laid out below her like a tactical exercise. Enemy fighters were moving in predictable patterns, converging on the last known location of the explosions while trying to maintain security around the canyon's exits. Their training was good, but they were following textbook procedures against an opponent who had written her own rules. Sarah's first shot dropped a fighter who was directing others toward her previous position. The suppressed rifle made little more than a whisper, but the effect on enemy morale was immediate and devastating. Suddenly, the hunters realized they might be the ones being hunted. Tactical movement became defensive scrambling as fighters sought cover from an unseen threat. Over the next hour, Sarah fought the kind of engagement that military historians would later study as a perfect example of asymmetric warfare. Single shots, precisely placed, eliminated key leaders and disrupted enemy coordination. Movement from position to position kept the enemy guessing about her location while allowing Sarah to maintain the initiative. But Sarah's real weapon wasn't her rifle, it was the psychological warfare she was conducting against fighters who had believed they were chasing a desperate, defeated enemy. Every shot demonstrated that the American sniper was still dangerous, still thinking tactically, still capable of turning the hunt around. The effect on enemy confidence was more devastating than the physical casualties. The turning point came when Sarah heard the distinctive sound of American helicopters approaching from the south. The radio chatter she intercepted confirmed what she had hoped: Rodriguez and a handful of volunteers had defied orders and mounted an unauthorized rescue mission. They had been tracking the enemy search pattern and had triangulated her position based on the sudden outbreak of gunfire. But the helicopters also brought a new problem. Nasir Shah's forces had been prepared for this possibility and had positioned surface-to-air missiles around the search area. Sarah watched in horror as the first Black Hawk was hit by a missile and spiraled toward the ground in a ball of flame. Her rescue had become a death trap for her would-be rescuers. The choice Sarah faced in that moment defined everything she had learned about being a Navy SEAL. She could remain hidden and safe while her teammates died trying to save her, or she could reveal her position and try to suppress the missile teams. The tactical calculus was simple: exposing herself meant almost certain death, but it might save the remaining helicopters. Sarah chose to fight. Her rifle spoke again and again, targeting the missile crews with precision shots that disrupted their ability to track and engage the helicopters. She drew fire from dozens of enemy weapons, exposing herself completely to save aircraft and crews she could barely see in the darkness. The second helicopter managed to land in the canyon, disgorging Rodriguez and 5 other SEALs who immediately began fighting their way towards Sarah's position. But the enemy response was overwhelming. Dozens of fighters were converging on the landing zone, and more vehicles were arriving every minute. Sarah's rescue had become a full-scale battle with odds that favored nobody. Rodriguez's voice crackled over Sarah's radio, calm and professional despite the chaos around him. He ordered her to move toward the landing zone, promised that they would cover her movement, and swore that they weren't leaving without her this time. But Sarah could see what Rodriguez couldn't: enemy positions that would make movement impossible, kill zones that would claim anyone who tried to cross them. Sarah made her final decision as a Navy SEAL. Instead of moving toward the rescue helicopter, she began advancing toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. If she was going to die in this canyon, she would take as many of them with her as possible and create the chaos necessary for Rodriguez and his team to escape. But survival sometimes comes from unexpected directions. As Sarah prepared for what she believed would be her final battle, the radio crackled with a new voice: official U.S. military coordination with close air support inbound. Rodriguez's unauthorized mission had been detected by higher command, and, rather than court-martial him, they had decided to support the operation with everything available. The sky lit up with tracer rounds and explosions as Apache helicopters engaged enemy positions throughout the canyon. F-16 fighter aircraft followed with precision strikes that eliminated the surface-to-air missile threats. In less than 10 minutes, the tactical situation reversed completely. The hunters became the hunted as American air power systematically destroyed every enemy position in the area. When Rodriguez finally reached Sarah's position, he found her wounded but alive, still providing sniper support for the rescue operation despite blood loss and exhaustion. She had been alone in enemy territory for 2 weeks, had survived on minimal supplies and pure determination, and had turned a desperate evasion into a tactical victory that eliminated one of the region's most dangerous enemy leaders. The helicopter ride back to base was surreal after weeks of silence and isolation. Rodriguez sat beside Sarah, his hand on her shoulder, repeating over and over that they should never have left her behind. Command had made a mistake, he said, a calculation error that had nearly cost them the best operator he had ever known. But Sarah's response surprised him. She wasn't angry about being abandoned, she was grateful for the experience. 2 weeks alone in hostile territory had taught her things about herself that no training could provide. She had discovered reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known existed. She had learned that SEALs really could endure anything. The medical evaluation at the forward operating base revealed the full extent of Sarah's ordeal. She had lost 20 pounds, suffered dehydration and malnutrition, and sustained several minor wounds during her final firefight. But, psychologically, she was stronger than ever. The isolation that should have broken her spirit had instead forged it into something unbreakable. Command's official report classified the mission as a successful personnel recovery operation. Sarah's 2 weeks of evasion were described as a textbook example of survival, evasion, resistance, and escape techniques. Her tactical intelligence about enemy operations led to several follow-up missions that significantly degraded local Taliban capabilities. But the real story was simpler and more profound than any official report could capture. Sarah Mitchell had been written off, abandoned, and left to die in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. She had survived through skills, determination, and an unshakable belief in her own worth as a human being and as a warrior. Rodriguez never forgot the lesson of Sarah's abandonment and rescue. In later years, as he rose through the ranks to positions of command responsibility, he made sure that "leave no man behind" wasn't just a motto but an absolute commitment. He never again allowed tactical considerations to override the moral obligation to bring everyone home. Sarah continued serving for another decade, eventually becoming an instructor at the Navy's survival school. She taught countless other operators the techniques that had kept her alive, but, more importantly, she taught them the mental discipline that turned survival from hope into certainty. The desert that had nearly claimed her life became a place of pilgrimage for Sarah. She returned several times during her career, not to the exact location of her ordeal, but to similar environments where she could test herself against the challenges that had once seemed impossible to overcome. On her final visit to Afghanistan, Sarah stood on a ridge overlooking the canyon where she had made her last stand. The tactical situation was completely different now, the enemy long gone, the war itself winding down. But the landscape was unchanged, beautiful, harsh, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. Sarah whispered a thank you to the desert that had tested her so severely and taught her so much about her own capabilities. Then, she turned toward the helicopter that would carry her home, knowing that she had proven something important. Navy SEALs really could endure anything, even abandonment, even despair, even the crushing weight of fighting alone against impossible odds. The motto "Leave no man behind" had failed her once, but Sarah had learned something more important. Sometimes, when everyone else abandons you, you have to save yourself. And sometimes, saving yourself is the hardest and most important mission you'll ever complete.